Good morning, students. It's another day of learning, and we thank God for giving us the opportunity and the privilege. This morning, we're going to be looking at disobedience. I take that again, disobedience. And we'll look at the meaning of disobedience, biblical account of first human disobedience, which you can find in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 to 9. And then we'll also be looking at consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience. And then finally, we'll be looking at students' disobedience and their consequences. The meaning of disobedience. Disobedience, simply defined, means refusing to do what someone who is in authority or the law or order, rules and regulation tells us to do. When we are expected to do something, when we have been instructed to do something and we refuse to do it, that is considered as disobedience. Disobedience also means to defy or break a rule or to go against the law of the land or the law of the society. Society here simply means every environment you find yourself have one rule or the other. Whether those rules are written or not, it does not matter. Like our school environments have rules and regulations. They are not written anywhere, but we know them because we have been told at one point or the other. Disobedience is a deliberate act of not doing what you are told to do. A deliberate act of not doing what you are told to do, either by your parents, your teachers, or someone that God has placed in authority. Sometimes it could include it includes your pastor in the church. God gives orders and God gives rules and commandments which we must or we are bound to obey. It is a sin for us to disobey God and the people that He has placed in authority over us. Every time we do that, we are considered to have been disobedient. Let's look at the biblical account of first human disobedience. That's what we can find in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 to 9. When God created Adam and Eve, He put them in the Garden of Eden and He gave them specific instructions on what to do and what not to do. Unfortunately, the devil came in and tempted them and they disobeyed God. And immediately they disobeyed God, the consequences was binding on them. That is, the penalties, the things that God said will happen, eventually happen. What did Adam and Eve do? Adam and Eve were placed in the Garden of Eden and were told not to eat a particular fruit or a particular tree, fruit from a particular tree. But they disobeyed and they went ahead and ate it. God visited them in the garden, but they were no longer confident to stand before God. And then they started running away. That's the biblical account of first human disobedience. And because they were disobedient to God, God had to punish them. What are the consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience? We can find that in Genesis chapter 3, verse 14 to 19. Number one is shame. They became ashamed. Normally, when God visited them in the Garden of Eden, they were bold, confident to appear before God. But because they had done something that is wrong, they were ashamed to come near to God. Number two is fear. One of the consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience was fear. They became afraid to approach God. They told God specifically that we heard your voice and we are afraid. Then another is guilt. They became guilty. They couldn't approach God because they were guilty. They became afraid because they were guilty. They had already judged themselves. God had not pronounced any judgment on them. So many of us do the same thing. Your mommy and your daddy just came back from the office. Instead of you to run out to go and meet them, you run into your room because you are guilty. You had done something that you were not supposed to do. And then the fourth consequence is curse. God pronounced curses on them. Let's look at the curses that God pronounced on them. Number one, God pronounced a curse on the serpent. The serpent was to crawl on his belly and to eat dust all the days of his life. The serpent was also pronounced, enmity was brought between the serpent and the woman. That's the first cause. So the first person that God caused was not the man or not the woman, it was the serpent. Number two, God caused the woman. The curse upon the woman was that in pain she will bring forth her own children, and her desire was to be on her husband, and that her husband was going to rule over her. Number three is a man. The ground was caused, the man was not caused directly, the ground was caused because of the man. Normally, the ground would yield fruit for the man, but now, when the man plants, the ground was going to yield thorns and thistles for him. The ground was no longer going to produce for him. And then God said to him, "You are going to eat from your own sweat." Before, the man didn't need to sweat before he harvests or reaps any fruit, but now he has to sweat. So those are the causes that was brought upon. Then collectively upon Adam and Eve, God also pronounced a curse. They were to die. They lost the good privilege and relationship they had with God. Adam and Eve had good relationship, good opportunity, good privilege to access God, to go to God. They were friendly with God. But from that time, they were no longer friendly with God. And finally, they were driven away from the Garden of Eden. Those were the consequences of first human disobedience. And then let's look at students' disobedience and their consequences. As children, as students, we get involved in one misdeeds or the other. We abuse privilege, abuse opportunities, do one thing or the other that we are not supposed to do. For instance, when we refuse to run errands for our parents, we refuse their orders, we refuse their instructions, we tell lies to them, we beat and cheat our younger ones, we abuse our older ones, and then we are involved in one nasty dealing or the other. We go into fighting and so on and so forth. When we do all that, we are disobedient to God because there's a commandment of God which tells us specifically, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12, that we should obey our mother and our father. We should obey our parents because this is the first commandment that has a promise attached to it. When we refuse to obey mom and dad, they may beat us or deny us of some of our rights and privileges. But above all, when we disobey them, we're disobeying a direct instruction from God. And not only are we losing our rights according to the punishment that our parents are going to give to us, we are going to also be punished by God. No one knows how God's punishment is going to come. In First Peter chapter 5 and verse 5, the Bible tells us specifically, you younger ones, be submissive to the older ones. When we get to school, when we find ourselves in school as students, there are rules and regulations guiding the school. For instance, teachers give us assignments, and most of the time we refuse to do those assignments. We disobey our teachers, disobey the prefects, disobey every other person. They are all against God's edicts and God's commandments, and they are punishable. As far as God's instructions are concerned, there are so many things that we do. In school, for instance, we disobey, we do examination malpractices, and then we do so many other things that are not permitted of us. For instance, many of us dodge school. Many of us absent ourselves from school without permission. Those things are disobedience to God. Disobedience in the school can get you flogging, can get you to cut grass, could get you suspension and even expulsion. But above all these things, the most important aspect of this disobedience is that God punishes every child that is disobedient. And that is why, apart from the physical punishment we get, we also get spiritual punishment from God. It's important that we don't involve ourselves in disobedience. Today, we have been able to look at the definition of disobedience, biblical account of first human disobedience, consequences of Adam and Eve's disobedience, and finally, we have also looked at students' disobedience and their consequences. We should be mindful of what we do so that we do not bring shame suffering and sorrow, not only to ourselves, but also to our parents. Thank you.